What you are watching unfold right now is not a loud collapse, but a quiet strategic defeat, the kind that only becomes obvious after the damage is already locked in. Because while attention is being pulled toward provocative tariff threats, insults, and late-night social media posts, a much more consequential shift is happening beneath the noise, one that exposes how fragile a strategy built on intimidation really is when the target refuses to panic. This is not a story about rhetoric. It is a story about leverage. And leverage only works when the other side believes you will use it, even if it hurts you too, which is where this entire trade confrontation begins to unravel. Because Canada, a country routinely dismissed as economically dependent and politically cautious, has identified the single greatest weakness in Donald Trump's approach to trade warfare, and has chosen to press directly on it. The weakness is not tariffs themselves, but credibility, and once credibility erodes, threats become performance rather than power. The turning point came quietly but unmistakably in January 2026, when Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped onto the stage at the World Economic Forum in Davos and reframed the global economic conversation in a way that fundamentally challenged Trump's worldview, not by attacking the United States directly, but by naming the reality many countries had already begun to feel, that middle powers cannot survive by waiting for permission from great powers, and that if you are excluded from decision-making tables, you inevitably become the object of decisions made by others. Those words landed hard because Trump was present, listening, and immediately recognized the implication that Canada was no longer positioning itself as a compliant junior partner, but as an independent actor capable of coordinating with others. The retaliation was swift and predictable: removal from advisory forums, escalating tariff threats, deliberately demeaning language designed to signal dominance. But what followed was unexpected, because instead of retreating or negotiating quietly, Carney met the threats in public, calmly and precisely, rejecting the narrative that Canada's prosperity is dependent on American benevolence, and labeling the tariff threats exactly for what they were: bluster unsupported by enforceable reality. This mattered because trade wars are psychological before they are economic, and once one side publicly demonstrates that it is not afraid, the entire structure of coercion starts to crack. The reason this confrontation does not play out the way Trump expects lies in the math, not the messaging. Because the US-Canada economic relationship is not asymmetric in the way Trump describes it. It is deeply integrated, mutual, and sensitive to disruption on both sides, with nearly $2 billion in goods and services crossing the border every single day, Canada serving as the largest export market for the United States, dozens of American states more economically dependent on Canadian trade than on any other foreign partner, and American energy security itself tied directly to Canadian oil and gas flows. Tariffs imposed at the scale Trump threatens would not function as punishment directed outward. They would operate as a self-inflicted shock, immediately visible in fuel prices, manufacturing costs, and employment figures across the United States, which is precisely why similar threats in the past have consistently been walked back once the economic consequences became unavoidable. Carney understands this, which is why he treats the threats as noise rather than leverage, and instead focuses on altering the structural conditions that allow those threats to exist in the first place. The most consequential move in this entire confrontation was not rhetorical at all, but commercial. Canada's decision to reopen and rebalance its trade relationship with China, a move Trump initially endorsed when it appeared to fit within his transactional framework, but later condemned once it became clear that it served a broader strategic purpose. By lowering barriers on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for restored access for Canadian agricultural exports, Canada did more than secure immediate economic relief for farmers and exporters. It sent a signal to the global market that it would no longer subordinate its trade policy entirely to U.S. political preferences, and that signal has already begun to compound. Trade discussions with India, Southeast Asia, and South American blocs are not symbolic gestures. They are redundancy-building exercises designed to ensure that no single country can credibly threaten Canada with economic isolation again. This is the part of the story that makes Trump's position untenable, because his strategy assumes dependence, and Carney's strategy systematically reduces it. The legal framework Trump would need to enforce his most extreme threats works against him as well, since the very trade agreement he championed now limits his ability to impose sweeping tariffs without violating its terms, and past attempts to bypass those constraints through emergency authorities have already triggered retaliation, domestic backlash, and partial reversals once the costs became politically unsustainable. When threats are made repeatedly and not carried out, they stop functioning as deterrents and start functioning as proof of limitation. And that is exactly the perception now forming among both foreign governments and domestic industries. The aircraft certification threat illustrates this dynamic perfectly, because it sounds dramatic but collapses under even minimal scrutiny, as planes already approved and operating cannot simply be decertified by executive decree without grounding private fleets, disrupting corporate travel, and triggering immediate legal challenges, all of which would land squarely on American companies and workers rather than Canadian manufacturers. This pattern repeats across sectors, escalating language followed by quiet clarification, maximalist claims followed by technical walkbacks, each cycle reinforcing the same conclusion, that the ceiling on what can actually be done is far lower than the rhetoric suggests. Meanwhile, Canada's response remains consistent, measured, and strategically focused on long-term insulation rather than short-term confrontation, even as the economic costs of uncertainty are felt at home through slowed manufacturing growth, delayed investment, and cautious wage dynamics, because Carney is betting that diversification pain now is preferable to vulnerability later. The broader implication extends well beyond Canada, because every country watching this dispute is learning the same lesson, that American market access, once considered indispensable at almost any political cost, now comes bundled with volatility that can be weaponized without warning, making alternative partnerships increasingly attractive despite their own complexities. This is how influence erodes, not through a single dramatic rupture, but through repeated demonstrations that pressure will be applied impulsively and withdrawn selectively, creating an environment where planning around U.S. policy becomes impossible. The approaching review of the Continental Trade Agreement amplifies these stakes, because it will force a choice between renegotiation under threat or disengagement under preparation, and Canada is making clear that it prefers the latter to submission. If that choice becomes explicit, the shock will not be limited to Ottawa or Washington. It will ripple outward as other countries recalibrate their own exposure and reconsider the assumption that alignment with the United States guarantees stability. The irony is that the tools being used to assert dominance are accelerating the very outcome they are meant to prevent, teaching partners how to function without American approval and making the prospect of doing so less daunting with each successful adjustment. This is why the trade war narrative misses the point, because the decisive battles are not being fought in tariff schedules but in supply chains, investment flows, and diplomatic networks that take years to build and decades to unwind. Once those networks shift, they do not snap back into place when leadership changes or rhetoric softens, because businesses and governments remember volatility far longer than they remember insults. The real consequence of this moment will not be measured by whether a particular tariff is imposed or withdrawn, but by whether the assumption of American indispensability survives intact, and based on the behavior now spreading across middle powers, that assumption is under more strain than at any point in recent history. Trump set out to demonstrate that economic pressure could force compliance. But what he is demonstrating instead is that pressure without predictability invites exit rather than obedience, and Canada's response is becoming a template rather than an exception. The message being absorbed globally is simple and profound, that resilience comes from options, not favors. And once enough countries internalize that lesson, the leverage that once came from sheer market size begins to dissolve. This is why the outcome of this confrontation matters to anyone watching their costs rise, their supply chains wobble, or their investments hesitate, because it signals a transition away from a system held together by trust toward one governed by hedging. And that transition, once underway, does not reverse easily. The world is not rejecting the United States outright, but it is learning how to operate as if American cooperation can no longer be assumed. And that shift, more than any tariff announcement, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines.